Once upon a time, there was a young man named Joseph, the son of Jacob, a man whose life seemed destined for great things. But, as with every story that begins under the brightness of the sun, there were shadows lurking in the darkest corners of the human heart. Joseph was loved by his father, and that love was visible to all. A special gift, a colorful tunic, was given to him, a symbol of affection that unwittingly ignited a dangerous flame in the hearts of his brothers. Envy, like a silent serpent, began to slither among them. Why him? That was the question, echoing in their thoughts. And so Joseph's story began, not with a shout but with a whisper of discontent that would soon turn into a roar. Joseph was a dreamer, and his dreams were not ordinary. They came wrapped in symbols and messages that seemed to come from a place beyond this world. In one of these dreams, he saw sheaves of wheat in the field. 11 sheaves bowed before his, as if recognizing him as superior. When he shared this with his brothers, the silence that followed was heavy, filled with a tension that could cut through the air. Does he really believe he will reign over us? They thought. The seed of discord had been planted, and the soil was fertile for hatred. Joseph's brothers could no longer bear the thought that he, the youngest, might one day become greater than them. On an ordinary day, while tending the sheep far from home, rage and envy overtook their hearts. "Let's get rid of him," one suggested. "Yes, but how?" asked another. Then the most terrible idea arose. Let's sell him as a slave. The coldness with which they decided their own brother's fate was frightening. They did not know it, but that decision would change not only Joseph's life, but the course of an entire nation. The day of betrayal arrived. Innocent and trusting, Joseph went to meet his brothers as usual, but instead of an embrace, he was met with cold stares and hands that grabbed him forcefully. The colorful tunic, the symbol of his father's love, was stripped from him. He cried out, he pleaded, but his brothers were deaf to his supplications. They threw him into a dark, damp cistern where the darkness seemed to swallow all hope. "What have I done to deserve this?" Joseph must have thought as tears ran down his face. But the worst was yet to come. While Joseph struggled against despair at the bottom of the cistern, his brothers bargained away his life for a few silver coins. He was sold to merchants traveling to Egypt, a distant and unknown land. The colorful tunic was stained with the blood of an animal, a carefully crafted lie to deceive their father. Jacob wept, believing his son was dead. But Joseph was alive, though his life would never be the same again. Thus began the journey of a young man who, unknowingly, was destined to become one of the most important figures in Egypt. Why God? Why is this happening to me? This must have been the question echoing in Joseph's heart. But as Scripture says, "For my thoughts are higher than your thoughts, and my ways higher than your ways." Isaiah 55:9. Egypt, a land of towering pyramids, mighty rivers, and a culture as rich as it is mysterious. However, for Joseph, there was no beauty in that land. He arrived as a slave, chained and humiliated, far from everything he knew. The merchants who bought him did not see a young man with dreams but merely merchandise, another piece to be traded in the slave market. As he walked through the streets of Memphis, Joseph felt the weight of loneliness and despair. Why, God, why did you allow this to happen to me? This must have been the question echoing in his heart. But even in that situation, there was something about Joseph that stood out, a dignity, a light that would not be extinguished, even in the darkest circumstances. As Psalm 34:18 says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Joseph was purchased by Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the royal guard. Potiphar was an influential man, and his house was a place of luxury and power. For Joseph, this could have been a relief, but he knew that his condition was still that of a slave. However, something in his character caught Potiphar's attention. Joseph worked with dedication, and everything he did prospered. It was as if the hand of God was upon him, blessing each of his steps. Potiphar soon realized that Joseph was no ordinary slave. He placed him as the overseer of his household, entrusting him with everything he owned. Joseph, in turn, remained faithful and upright, honoring the trust that had been given to him. But as Proverbs 3:5-6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight." But not everything was peaceful in Potiphar's house. His wife, a woman of remarkable beauty, began to notice Joseph. He was young, handsome, and above all different from all the other men she knew. One day she decided to test Joseph's integrity. "Lie with me," she said, with a look that left no doubt about her intentions. However, Joseph resisted. How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" he replied, standing firm in his faith. But Potiphar's wife did not give up. Day after day she persisted until, in a moment of desperation, she falsely accused him of attempting to seduce her. Potiphar, furious, had Joseph thrown into prison without questioning his innocence. Once again, Joseph became the victim of injustice. But as Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." The Egyptian prison was a place of darkness and despair. For Joseph, it seemed like the end of everything. He who had been elevated to a position of trust in Potiphar's house was now chained and forgotten. Yet even in that situation, Joseph did not lose faith. He knew that God was with him even when everything seemed lost. In prison, he continued to demonstrate his integrity and skills. Soon, the chief jailer noticed that Joseph was different from the other prisoners. He put him in charge of the other inmates, and everything Joseph did prospered. But the question still echoed in his heart: "Why, God? Why am I here?" He did not know it yet, but that prison was just another chapter in a greater plan. As Jeremiah 29:11 says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." One day, 2 new prisoners arrived in Joseph's cell. They were Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker, important men who had fallen from grace. One night, both had strange and disturbing dreams. When they awoke, they were confused and distressed. Joseph, noticing their affliction, asked, "Why are you so sad today?" They told him about their dreams, and Joseph, with the wisdom that only God could give, interpreted them. To the cupbearer he said, "In 3 days you will be restored to your position." But for the baker, the news was not as good. "In 3 days you will be executed." And so it happened. The cupbearer was released, but the baker lost his life. Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him when he stood before Pharaoh, but as Ecclesiastes 3:1 says, "There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens." The cupbearer forgot about Joseph, and he remained in prison, waiting for God's perfect timing. The days in prison turned into months, and the months into years. Joseph, now a mature man, continued to wait. He had accurately interpreted the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker, but the cupbearer, once restored to his position, forgot to mention Joseph to Pharaoh. For many, this could have been the final blow, the moment when hope completely fades. But Joseph was not like most. He knew that God's timing is perfect, even when it seems delayed. While waiting, he continued to serve with excellence, caring for the other prisoners and keeping his faith unshaken. As Psalm 27:14 says, "Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord." Joseph did not know it, but the moment of his deliverance was closer than he imagined. While Joseph waited in prison, something extraordinary was happening in Pharaoh's palace. The ruler of Egypt had 2 dreams that deeply troubled him. In the first, he saw 7 fat cows being devoured by 7 thin cows. In the second, 7 full and good ears of grain were consumed by 7 withered ears, scorched by the wind. Pharaoh awoke disturbed, knowing that these dreams had an important meaning, but no one in his kingdom could interpret them. Pharaoh's distress was palpable, and news of his unrest spread throughout Egypt. It was then that the chief cupbearer finally remembered Joseph. "Today I remember my faults," he said to Pharaoh. "There is a young Hebrew in prison who interprets dreams with accuracy." Desperate for answers, Pharaoh immediately sent for Joseph. Joseph was quickly brought from prison to the palace. After washing and dressing properly, he was taken into Pharaoh's presence. The ruler of Egypt looked at him and said, "I have heard that you can interpret dreams." Joseph, with humility and wisdom, replied, "I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh an answer that brings peace." Pharaoh then told his dreams, and Joseph, inspired by God, explained, "The two dreams have the same meaning. The 7 fat cows and the 7 good ears of grain represent 7 years of abundance. The 7 thin cows and the 7 withered ears represent 7 years of famine that will follow." God is warning Pharaoh to prepare. Joseph's interpretation not only revealed the future, but also offered a solution. Find a wise and capable man to manage the food supplies during the years of abundance, so that Egypt will not perish during the famine. Pharaoh was impressed by Joseph's wisdom. He saw that the Spirit of God was with this man and decided to appoint him as governor of all Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. Joseph was given the royal signet ring, fine linen robes, and a gold chain around his neck. He was placed in a royal chariot, and the people bowed before him as he passed. Joseph, who had been sold as a slave and forgotten in prison, was now the most powerful man in Egypt after Pharaoh. As Genesis 41:39-40 says, "Can we find anyone like this man in whom is the Spirit of God? You shall be over my house, and all my people shall obey your commands." But despite all the glory and power, Joseph never forgot who had elevated him to that position. He knew that everything was part of God's plan. Joseph immediately began preparing Egypt for the years of famine. During the 7 years of abundance, he oversaw the collection and storage of large quantities of grain. Storehouses were built in every city, and the surplus was carefully preserved. When the years of famine finally arrived, Egypt was ready. The famine spread throughout the land, but in Egypt there was food. People from all nations came to Egypt to buy grain, and Joseph was responsible for distributing it. He who had been betrayed and forgotten was now God's instrument to save lives. But Joseph's story was not yet over. As Genesis 50:20 says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." While Egypt prospered under Joseph's leadership, famine spread across other lands, including Canaan, where Jacob and his family lived. The situation was desperate. The once fertile fields were now dry and barren. The livestock, once numerous, were wasting away from hunger. Jacob's family's food supplies were rapidly running out, and the patriarch knew he had to make a difficult decision. He called his sons and said, "Why are we sitting here waiting for death? Go down to Egypt and buy food for us so that we may survive." Thus Joseph's brothers, except for Benjamin, the youngest, set out for Egypt. They had no idea that they were about to reunite with the brother they had betrayed years before. As Proverbs 16:9 says, "In their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps." When Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt, they were brought before the governor, who was none other than Joseph himself. They bowed down before him without recognizing him. Joseph, however, recognized his brothers immediately. Memories of the cistern, the sale as a slave, and years of suffering came rushing back. He could have revealed himself at that moment, but he decided to act cautiously. "Where do you come from?" he asked in a firm and authoritative voice. "From Canaan," they replied. "We have come to buy food." Joseph accused them of being spies, and they, terrified, vehemently denied it. To test them, Joseph demanded that they bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, as proof of their honesty. Meanwhile, Simeon was held as a hostage. The brothers, confused and fearful, returned to Canaan, unaware that they were part of a greater plan. As Genesis 42:9 says, "Then Joseph remembered the dreams which he had dreamed about them." Back in Canaan, the brothers told Jacob everything that had happened in Egypt, the news that Simeon was imprisoned, and that they needed to take Benjamin. To free him devastated the patriarch. "You are taking my children away from me," he cried. "Joseph is gone, Simeon is in prison, and now you want to take Benjamin? Everything is against me." Reuben tried to calm his father, promising to bring Benjamin back, but Jacob was not convinced. The situation seemed hopeless until the famine worsened, leaving the family with no choice. Judah, taking the lead, said to his father, "I will be responsible for Benjamin. If I do not bring him back, I will bear the blame forever." Reluctantly, Jacob agreed. He blessed his sons and sent them back to Egypt with gifts and double the silver for the governor. As Genesis 43:14 says, "May God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, so that he will release your other brother and Benjamin." When the brothers arrived in Egypt with Benjamin, Joseph received them with hospitality. He ordered a banquet to be prepared in his house, which left the brothers even more confused and fearful. During the meal, Joseph showed favoritism toward Benjamin, giving him larger portions. The brothers were surprised but said nothing. However, Joseph had not yet revealed his identity. He decided to test them once more. The next day, as the brothers departed, Joseph ordered his silver cup to be placed in Benjamin's sack. Shortly after they left, he sent his servants to accuse them of theft. When the cup was found in Benjamin's sack, the brothers were in despair. They returned to Joseph, and Judah, in an emotional speech, offered himself to stay in Benjamin's place as a slave. It was at that moment that Joseph saw the change in his brothers' hearts. As Genesis 44:33 says, "Now then, please let your servant remain here as my lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers." Joseph could no longer contain his emotions. He ordered all his servants to leave the room and, with tears in his eyes, revealed his identity to his brothers. "I am Joseph," he said. "Is my father still alive?" His brothers were paralyzed with shock and fear. They could not believe that the governor of Egypt was the brother they had betrayed. Joseph, however, reassured them, "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." He explained that everything was part of God's plan to preserve their family during the famine. Joseph then embraced his brothers, weeping with them. Forgiveness was given, and reconciliation was complete. As Genesis 45:5 says, "And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." While Joseph reconciled with his brothers in Egypt and Canaan, Jacob still lived in the anguish of not knowing the fate of his sons. He spent his days in prayer, crying out to God for protection and guidance, until one day, like any other, his sons returned with news that would change everything. "Joseph is alive," they announced, their voices filled with joy and relief. "He is the governor of Egypt." At first, Jacob could not believe it. His mind, weary from years of pain and uncertainty, struggled to process such a revelation. But when he saw the chariots and the gifts Joseph had sent, his heart was filled with hope. "Enough," he said. "My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." As Genesis 45:28 says, "Enough, my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Jacob's family set out for Egypt, a journey that would mark the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. They took with them everything they owned, their flocks, their tents, and their hopes. Along the way, Jacob stopped in Beersheba to offer sacrifices to God. It was there that the Lord spoke to him in a vision, "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back." Genesis 46:3-4. These words gave Jacob the certainty that God was with him, guiding every step. When they finally arrived in Egypt, Joseph went out to meet his father. The reunion was emotional. Joseph embraced Jacob and they both wept for a long time. "Now I can die in peace," Jacob said, "for I have seen your face and know that you are still alive." Jacob lived in Egypt for 17 years, surrounded by his family and the prosperity that Joseph had achieved. But he knew his days were coming to an end. Before passing away, he called Joseph and his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, to bless them. Placing his hands on their heads, Jacob pronounced words of blessing and prophecy. He intentionally crossed his hands, blessing Ephraim, the younger, above Manasseh, the firstborn. Joseph tried to correct him, but Jacob insisted, "I know, my son, I know. He too will become a people, and he too will be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a multitude of nations." Genesis 48:19. Jacob also blessed each of his sons, prophesying about the future of the 12 tribes of Israel. As Genesis 49:28 says, "All these are the 12 tribes of Israel. And this is what their father said to them when he blessed them, giving each the blessing appropriate to him. After blessing his sons, Jacob departed this life in peace, surrounded by those he loved. Joseph, deeply saddened, ordered the Egyptian physicians to embalm his father's body, as was customary at the time. He then requested permission from Pharaoh to take Jacob back to Canaan, where he would be buried in the cave of Machpelah, alongside his parents and grandparents. Pharaoh agreed, and a great procession set out for Canaan. It was a solemn moment, full of tears and memories. When the funeral was over, Joseph and his brothers returned to Egypt, but Jacob's passing left a void in Joseph's heart. He knew that although his father was at peace, his own journey was not yet over. As Genesis 50:14 says, "After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury his father." With Jacob's death, Joseph's brothers became fearful. They thought that without their father's presence, Joseph might seek revenge for the wrong they had done to him in the past. So they approached Joseph and said, "Before he died, our father instructed us to ask for your forgiveness for the sins we committed against you." When Joseph heard this, he wept. Then he replied, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God turned it into good to save many lives today." Genesis 50:19-20. Joseph reassured them that he would take care of them and their families, keeping them safe in Egypt. He lived to be 110 years old, witnessing his children and grandchildren grow. Before he died, Joseph made a solemn promise. God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Genesis 50:24. And so Joseph's story came to an end, but his legacy of faith, forgiveness, and trust in God continued to inspire generations. And so ends the incredible story of Joseph of Egypt, a man who faced betrayal, slavery, and injustice, but never lost his faith in God. His life teaches us that even in the most difficult situations, God is in control, working all things for the good of those who love him. If you enjoyed this narrative and want to be inspired by more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to receive updates on upcoming videos.